Robert Shaw is an acclaimed art historian and author. He has written for the Sunday Times, the Metro, and the Guardian as an art journalist. If you want to learn how scandal, AI, and scarcity shape the art world, and also learn Andy Warhol's life, his legacy, and much more, this episode is for you. First, we start with art's power to provoke. Then we explore AI art and the ethics of it. Third, we dive into Andy Warhol's legacy and the cost of fame. Then we finish with actionable insights on personal growth and creativity. What drives the art world's continued fascination with scandal, shock value, and provocation? What's your opinion on that?
Well, what drives the world beyond the art world's fascination with all of these things? It's a way of drawing attention, isn't it? And it's always saying there's something new, there's something surprising, something you have to know about, something that hasn't been done before. It's like a version of originality in a way, and everybody always wants to know what's next. So I think if you can do that, of course, what lasts is often different. And if you're in the art world, then you also have to be sort of shock of the new. You're interested in what's happening that hasn't happened before, but also you don't want to be too distracted by things that are simply sensational. You want them to be things that actually are going to resonate forever, if possible, and if not, then for at least for 20 minutes.
Yeah. Is there a bias for novelty then in human psychology? Is that one of the reasons?
Well, that's a big question. But I mean, what I'd say specifically, because I don't feel qualified to answer that, but specifically in relation to the art world, it's sort of split actually, and in the arts generally, in that if you want people to buy things and to pay significant sums for it, then often what they prefer is something that is a sure value, that so actually a bit more of what they've already got, which is why, if you want to make an investment in art, and a lot of people buy art in that way, certainly when we're talking about big auction art, then what they like is scarcity value, and where there's a really established kind of, people have agreed for long enough that this is of a certain quality. Because actually to put money into new things and novelties, and even things that have done, very well and have been praised in the first place, that after that sort of first wave of opinion, there'll often be a revision of that. And it may leave you holding something that has very little commercial value. So you better love it for itself if you're going to invest in it, rather than think a sort of object you can trade. Say around Brit art, when Damien Hirst, Tracy Emmett, and Sarah Lucas first sort of came to the fore, they were supported by Charles Saatchi, among others. And, an important thing was that I think he bought quite a lot of the work and believed in it in the way of, a warehouse caught fire that destroyed quite a lot of the work at one point as well. But, you need somebody to underwrite you in that way. But I suppose, yeah, people love novelty, but they also do love things that they already know really quite well. Both. The answer is both.
Picasso says good art is copy, great art is steal, and that art is theft. What do you make of this, and how often do history's most famous artists steal from the works of others?
Well, Picasso. I think Eliot said, T.S. Eliot said something similar. And lots of people have said something like that. And I did write this book. And I'm not doing this as an ad for the book. We just say it was called Beg, Steal and Borrow, and then the subtitle, which actually was written by a friend rather than me, or suggested by a friend. Artists Against Originality, which is kind of the idea, but kind of not in some. But that's to say, Picasso is getting at there in ways there is nothing new under the sun, and very hard to find any gesture you can make as an artist, as a creative, as a person who wants to make things that has no kind of lineage to things that are. And I guess in the digital age, we've become more and more sort of fixated on that, partly through questions about copyright and intellectual property and the difficulty of defending that and being paid for the work that you do. Um, but also, that, so for instance, take an example, Dürer, Albrecht Dürer, a German artist, um, who creates prints and multiple copies. So he sells work that is reproducible, where there's already an edition. I don't think he particularly limits the edition in the first place, but actually a lot of those works are based on Renaissance paintings of the works that he then adapts and copies in some degree into his own works. And then he's very upset when, so for instance, the artist Albrecht Dürer, a German artist who created prints of his own work, and he sold them. And in these prints, he did make copies and adaptations of earlier works, sometimes statuary, sometimes paintings. But then he was very upset when his own work was sort of stolen and sold in editions as well. And everybody wants to sort of have the idea what is theirs, but they can borrow from other people all the time. And I think that's an issue we've had for a long time, and we have increasingly reproducible things. Very few, the idea of real scarcity is in terms of artistic production is quite a difficult notion now. I don't know how easy it is to sell internet art even now, because this was a big question a decade ago. This will be the new thing, and I'm not quite sure how far we've got with it.
What was the predictions for selling art on the internet versus the reality today?
I mean, I think so with NFTs, which you would remember, and obviously, sort of guarantees that come with blockchain and that sort of thing. And obviously, there was tremendous vogue for that, particularly at the moment of COVID, when people were possibly feeling a bit bored and they couldn't go out anyway. I don't know, because value generally is based on scarcity, and that's why there are very few great old master paintings that are on sale. And when they do come up for sale, they go for a very high price, or of an artist, where there's an established sort of catalogue raisonné of their works and they have value, and a work comes up and you'll pay a lot for that because it's difficult to get a work by. Picasso made quite a lot, but even Picasso, although he did lots of prints. So I don't know. I mean, just in terms of, thinking about the economics of it, it's quite tricky. Art that exists only virtually.
Mm. Do you think that having, like, keeping your art as scarce as possible and also taking the traditional gallery route is probably more effective if you want your work to be valuable than just having it scarce and selling it via your website, for example? Do you think it's...
Well, I mean, so essentially, what should an artist do setting out now with their career? Well, Jacob, are you an artist setting out in his career by any chance? But you're a photographer. I mean, and so actually, tell me about photography and sort of, because obviously photography, you use digital camera, or you?
Yeah, I'm digital. I actually don't know how to use a film camera, embarrassingly. I need to learn how to do that.
So do you make prints at all?
I've had practice doing so. It's something I definitely need to get more into, but I haven't made any prints yet that I've shown to, for example, like galleries or spaces, but I've got one lined up in November to send to somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, there is, in the first place, although I speak as an, I won't say old person, but older person, there is a pleasure in looking at things on walls or in physical spaces. And for that to happen, obviously you need to produce prints of works, or paint on canvas, or create a statue that you can walk around, or that high relief or low relief. So I don't know how you'd set out, but it seems to me that just in terms of being able also to create, of art. Depending, you can go down the journalism route, of course, where you make work and you sell it at the time, and maybe afterwards it sort of gets collected together. Or you can make work that essentially is for collectors. And obviously, if the work is for collectors, then some kind of limitation on the number of copies that you authenticate is important. And Andy Warhol, about whom we're going to speak, he was very interesting on this. And I think his estate and the people who manage his sort of foundation now have given up on the idea of authenticating his works because he was very loose in his practices. And I think he quite enjoyed that. And one, he was involved in some degree in making a lot of the work. And then afterwards, was he terribly bothered about how many versions were made and how much oversight did he have on any of it? But he's a great kind of lesson in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, and in just touching on kind of almost outsourcing the actual process of making the work, isn't that something that Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst have done as well?
I mean, a lot of any artist who runs a studio will do that in some ways. And, you can go back to old masters as well and, sort of look at work by Rembrandt and Rubens. And you will have, beyond my knowledge, but connoisseurs of that work who will say this passage of the painting, that's definitely by the named artist. And this is done by somebody in studio. And sometimes it's somebody who then goes on to have a career in their own name. And they might say, this passage is probably done, we can see in the brushwork a similarity to, this person instead of maybe they did this particular bit of it. So I think it's a bit like kind of auteur theory with film, that you have somebody who controls the overall production, but actually is it their hand at all times that is responsible? There it depends a lot on the nature of the work. So there's this tremendous illustrator I really love and ended up doing so. I went to interview him 20 years ago now, called Gruhl. And, his work was really all about, he did a lot of advertising work, but for fashion houses. But it was all about the line, just this incredibly elegant line as an illustrator. And I think there, if he'd sort of passed off a lot of that work to somebody else, then that would have been disappointing because it was just this kind of wonderfully sinuous and also a way of reducing the world in the way he saw. That was very beautiful. Whereas people who work at scale in other ways, maybe it's less important, but actually that, ultimately they decide. That goes back to Marcel Duchamp, of course, and the decision to, in the first place, display a urinal in a gallery and say this is art and call it fountain. You give it the name that would fit with an artwork. And, what he says at that point is the main thing is that it is the artist that decides. And so I suppose in terms of, whose hand does what within the creation of any work, again, the main thing is that the named artist, brand, is often fairly difficult to distinguish from a brand, is the one that decides, that chooses. So it's about that, really.
Yeah. And what do you think the criticisms for that? So someone who has the mind but doesn't do the hand work and do the technical work per se, and someone who puts a urinal in a gallery, a lot of people have obviously criticised that. And what are your thoughts on that kind of method and style?
I mean, I don't think it matters in the least. I think it's, and even this doesn't matter. I'm going to say something about transparency, and that it's quite nice to know who does what. Do people have to? I mean, you shouldn't be dishonest about it. Whether you have to explain everything about how you do everything, well, people don't. They never do, and it's impossible anyhow. But I mean, I'm reasonably at ease myself with the idea of sort of conceptualism, and not just from early in the 20th century. That um, the and also the importance is the work itself rather than, I mean, that's the thing. Um, it's the work itself. Does the work itself reward you in certain ways? Is it interesting in the ways that it appears to be? And then it's a shorthand that we put somebody's name to it. But the truth is, there's almost always somebody else involved in the production of that. There was so when I was a young man, a writer, an American writer called Raymond Carver sort of became tremendously uh, voguish and, really good writing, quite minimal though. So a lot of it is the sort of the things that are left out. And so you say Carver, a great writer, and um, after he'd sort of been fashionable for a while, it became clear that actually he'd been quite heavily dependent, or he'd collaborated with an editor, his editor, who'd been the one who was quite good at actually taking out words and sentences and saying, maybe, Raymond, we can do a little less here and that will be more powerful. And so the work is still published as Raymond Carver's, and that seems fine. But actually, without this other hand, would the work have been as powerful? And ultimately, so long as the work is great to read, does it really matter? And in terms of kind of financial satisfaction of all, that's up to the producers to decide among themselves. So, I think we love the idea of, and again, that comes back to the way that we love the idea of originality, is that it has to be from one person. It comes out of their brain. It's created by them solely. Whereas actually almost everything is the result of collaboration. And I think, the internet has made us much easier with the idea of the hive mind, hasn't it? And actually the hive mind has existed for a very long time. It's just become easier to sort of tap into other people's thinking. Um, and then, of course, it's become much more difficult to control what happens afterwards. Um, but actually, there's sort of something that is expressed um, at scale and with extreme rapidity by the internet in that is just true of sort of the way we live as humans. And so, the idea that one person is solely responsible for anything, I think best to kind of rest that.
Yeah. That brings me to AI though, because a lot of the stuff you're saying could be an argument for AI generated art or photography. What is there a difference between humans copying humans versus AI copying AI in terms of creation of artwork?
So with sort of generative AI, I guess, I mean, I don't, I think like a lot of people, I don't like the idea of things not being created by a human because actually what I'm interested in most of the time when I look at things is I'm interested in communicating with other humans and understanding other humans because the only game in town in a way. But of course, you can enjoy looking at nature and being in nature, and it could be a nature shaped by humans, but equally we like nature that is wild and the mountains that exist without any diggers being involved in removing moving parts of Earth or anything like that. So is AI in that sense a new kind of nature that exists around us and just generates a world? Um, I don't know. I mean, I think if you say, if I look at something and find it quite interesting, and then you say this was generated entirely by I might lose interest in it because part of what I'm doing when I read a book, when I look at a photograph, when I read Andy Warhol's diary, although this was created in a very particular way, um, is I'm interested in trying to think about the thought processes and the motivations of the person who did that, what they were trying to do, how they did it, and obviously that bit is removed entirely by generative AI.
What if the a human prompts AI to make something, so they type something in, is that different for you?
Yeah, absolutely. In that, I mean, I think there's really something about what's called responsible AI, which is that, the key thing is that there is always human oversight with the use of AI. So, again, we have a society, if you I think back to my earliest days, to the Stone Age, but that actually the way we live is driven by technology, and a lot of technology is quite accidental, actually. That when um, somebody first hits upon a notion and then it gets developed, they don't necessarily know what's going to be done with it. And this has been true from the earliest times. And so, when you sort of in the Industrial Revolution, or the Romans, you know, beginning to work with concrete or whatever, and then you find new ways of working that are suggested by the thing that's been created for a particular purpose. And that's certainly true of, for instance, digital culture, or digital culture and the internet. And we find new things to do with something that already exists. And so that's the way we've always been. And so when you have the printing press, then suddenly artists find new ways of working using a printing press. And where typewriter is created, then again, certain kind of artist thinks about what you could do with that. And when oil paints are developed, then there's a new way of working that comes as a result of that. But it may not have been the reason that the technology was developed in the first place, but that's just human ingenuity, working with the things that are created for whatever reason. Um, so, again, there's nothing new under the sun. And although the things that are done with AI are new in themselves, the actual process and that sort of combination of human intelligence and wit and dexterity, using a tool, that's not new. Um, and then it's really, how interesting is it what you create? How much time is it worth? Is it worth thinking about? Yeah, just is it worth your time?
Has there been any AI generated, even by human, and eventually created by AI, artwork in any major galleries yet? Do you think that would be a possibility if it hasn't happened yet?
Well, there's photography. So there's this picture called The Electrician, which was entered into the Sony World Photography Awards and won the top prize in the creative category. And it was created with AI. So of course, when that was sort of understood more widely, it did create a debate. But I mean, I think those debates are important to have initially, but then quite quickly things get subsumed into the way we just work and think. So yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, unless the artist has been responsible for creating the technology, the specific technology that creates the work, actually to remove the human component makes something less interesting and less, I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about that? What do you think about? Because you are a digital native. I am not. For me, the whole of my life, this will be something out there that I wasn't born with, that hit me very hard. So what do you think?
I'm more. I think maybe I don't know. I'm more. I'm quite open to it, but I see it more as a tool for now, anyway, rather than a direct thing I'm creating and wanting to show to the world or put in a gallery. That might change, but in terms of, I feel like there might be a generation of artists that have their work in major galleries that has been either completely made by AI or heavily influenced by AI in the future, kind of like how photographers, not straight away, but over a few decades, ended up getting their prints in galleries. Obviously, I still think the human connection and component of AI work is still important. So I'd rather a human have gone through the process of prompting the AI to make the work rather than AI generating it solely itself. I think I agree with you on that. There's more of a connection. But even for my work, like when I do clips on YouTube, a lot of the images I make right now are AI generated images or influenced by AI just to avoid copyright. But that might change. So I see it as a tool more than anything at the moment, but that might change.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly healthy. And I don't see any issue with that. Of course, what's hilarious is when I say hilarious. Is it hilarious? I'm not sure. Well, we'll see. We'll see. I've not really thought of what I say next, but with Chat GPT and where people use that in order to create CVs or job applications. Um, what remains very important, and then and you can kind of feed in the information from a job ad and see what it comes up with. The problem is you may end up submitting something that is identical to, 100 other candidates for the same role. So it is then the human intervention. I mean, again, why not use ChatGPT, for instance, or other such tools as a way to sort of stimulate thought it's like a conversation you could have with friends, or it democratizes a certain kind of wisdom and knowledge and social network, actually. And I think that's a good thing, but it does still rely on the human to look at it and go, is this exactly right? And also, I don't want it to sound as though it's just been written by AI. And also then, so how do I tweak it? What do I do that makes it really mine? And I would say that is the history of, human creativity. What do I do to make it mine, largely when so much of it is suggested by what already exists or what can be almost auto-generated?
Yeah. And a lot of photographers, including ones I've had on the show so far, have been very upset by AI because they've, for example, a few episodes ago, photographer Steve Bloom, he said he searched up an eagle flying over a waterfall on ChatGPT or similar AI, and the image it created was almost identical to the one that he shot. And I was just wondering, because you've spoken a lot about kind of artists stealing from one another, is it okay? Do you think it's fine that AI is allowed to use a lot of photographers' images, and is it just doing what humans naturally do anyway, but on a more efficient and larger scale in terms of copying and stealing photos and work from others?
Um, yeah, is it okay? It's always a tricky sort of question, a big question. I think that it's not fair, obviously, that a certain kind of technology can steal the livelihood of people who spend their time making things, and then that it can be sort of scanned, reframed in some degree to make it slightly different, and that the pay for that work goes to, well, whoever runs that technology instead. And I think that's a bad idea for our society broadly, because one, sounding paranoid, it puts a lot more power in the hands of corporations that develop these technologies. And it's why, for instance, again, I'm going to go back to this book I wrote called Beg, Steal and Borrow, which was about copyright and how that operates. It's quite a different, in the visual arts, quite a difficult thing, actually. When you're dealing with words, there are rules that are fairly easy to apply because it's about the length of a passage that you quote and how you do it. Whereas actually with images, it's more complicated because the law likes to work in terms of things that are measurable in the language of the law, which is words, the visuals. But the sort of Copyright Acts and Patent Acts, which are quite important, there are some quite stirring sort of statements of why we have those, which is to encourage human endeavor and people to take a chance in a way sometimes to create things where because you can put a lot of time into with this is to extend it to patents, but developing an idea that may have some application that is of great value to a lot of people. And what copyright and patenting allow you to do, especially on a smaller scale, is to take a chance. And you may spend 5 years of your life doing something and it doesn't work out. And then, okay, well, there we go. But if it does work out, um, you're encouraged to sort of maybe take a chance on a notion that you think is really interesting, because there is the possibility of reward at the end of it. And so some protection for some period of time where actually the rewards for fruits of your labor come to you. And I think in terms of just having a creative society, and that's not creative just in, kind of narrowly artistic terms, but just making things for everybody. Um, it's a good idea to have protections so that people have a reason to sort of set out on those journeys, because lots of people benefit from it. It's fruitful for society as a whole in many cases. Obviously, there will be counterexamples as well. I'm not going to go into those, but it's generally something we do need to do, which is to protect people's efforts, and probably with art. Actually, the way that in the 20th century copyright was extended possibly became a bit exaggerated, because it's 70 years beyond the life of the artist, which is a long time. And whereas, I mean, for the most part, copyright, if you're a writer, for instance, it's mostly about the first 5 years as to whether you'll make any money out of something. There are obviously very well-known other examples, but whether it needs to be 70 years beyond the life of, maybe that's just too much, and that made it too much in favor of also people who were already doing extremely well, rather than people who were trying to scrape a living out of doing something that was interesting to some people, but not enough to make them very wealthy. So I think we certainly need to protect human endeavor, and certainly individual human endeavor. And yeah, and digital culture is a bit of a threat to that. While digital culture is also a vast sort of benefit to a democratization of things.
Yeah.
Equally.
And the
So,
thing is, if you put a lot of effort into something, a lot of time and energy, and it's meant to be kind of an expression of self, you wouldn't, when you put it out to the world, you wouldn't want it to not be your possession, at least if you're not selling it, right?
yeah, I mean, I suppose then I see what you mean, and I agree with you in principle. It's just it's a sort of thought doesn't really fit contemporary technology, because if you're thinking of, you put it out to the world as being on the internet, then that's kind of, well, that world doesn't respect those notions, even though those notions might be, you know, um, very human, traditional, and defensible. It's just kind of, well, okay, how are you going to make that work?
Yeah, well, because on Instagram, I think, isn't it, once you post something, it's basically copyright free from that platform.
Yeah, I don't know if Instagram works in that way. Yeah.
Photo on Instagram, the copyright for it on Instagram.
Oh, yeah. Where actually it's Instagram that. Yeah. So I would. Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you post an image of a copyrighted work by somebody else, which lots of people do when they go around, take selfies in places, then obviously Instagram doesn't get to own that. But there's that. I mean, there's the whole of the law surrounding platforms that allow user-generated content, and that's quite complicated in terms of who owns or has the license to things while they are there. But that's partly to do with platforms. When you put in the old days, if you put and you can still do it, obviously, is putting works in a book, and then the book is published by a publisher, and the copyright in the works themselves, if you as a photographer did that, copyright in the work, yours. The book, though, is created with the publisher. Who owns the book as such? Well, you own a strand of it, but actually I think it's the publisher that really owns the book in that sense. So, I mean, so there are always, depending on the medium in which you publish something, there's always a kind of compromise involved. That, again, we love the sort of the notion of purity of originality, creativity, and ownership. And actually, when you sort of dig into it, it's always really hard to have that as unique.
Mm.
But I think certainly it is reasonable that we should try to legislate so that yeah, people get to keep as theirs things that they, as you say, put real effort into making. And of course, the truth is, most of the time, most people are not interested in copying most things. And so it's quite easy to post things and they're just yours and nobody's going to challenge. You know, it's the sort of hard cases of when suddenly something becomes valuable for another reason that's maybe not predicted. And it's not necessarily easy to write laws that make a distinction between a kind of easy sharing, where actually you just put it there and people like to look at it, and that's nice. It's like having it on wall in your house, and you allow people to come in and have a look at it. That's fine. They walk away afterwards. They've enjoyed it. You've enjoyed it. This is a human communion of some kind. But actually, on the internet, obviously, it's quite easy to rip copies or to screenshot them. Or so, yeah, it's an evolving situation.
Yeah, and if you want your work to be valuable, not just as an artist, but more as a photographer, we were mentioning printing earlier. Do you think that's a good way to make sure your work has value, is making it physical? So, for example, for a photographer, printing it out and then hopefully getting it into a gallery that kind of bypasses the internet issues and makes sure it's valuable as long as it's scarce.
Yeah, I mean that's why artists have editions of things, so that the owner, uh, Eduardo Palozzi. Oh, they're just out of shot, but anyway, Eduardo Palozzi things that are really nice, and that they one of edition of 30 of some collages that he made, and then they're lithographs, and so they're not of extraordinary value or anything like that, but it's kind of, well, you in buying something like that, you have a sense of how many there are in the world, and that you've got it so your neighbors won't all have the same things. Like buying a certain kind of clothing in a high fashion moment, you want some scarcity value. Um, if everybody bought Apple products, would Apple be able to sell them for the same price still? I mean, obviously, for everybody to be able to afford to buy them, they have to lower the price in the first place. But it's kind of, you know, um, some scarcity value is, but yes, to have a limited number of something in circulation, just from the point of view of human psychology and purchasing things, is obviously still important for artists, because that's an established way of getting people to pay for something and to be a supporter somehow, because that's kind of what it is. So yes, I want to collect your work. And there are all these vast numbers of works that have been created and where huge sums of money have been paid for them, and they are either in storage in Switzerland or, all of the big galleries in the UK, for instance, have their underground storage facilities in various towns and cities around the world as well. A lot of it's not seen for the holdings will never be seen again, possibly, because we just collect and collect and we make more and more things. But to have an original or one of a limited number overseen and signed by the artist, this is, this remains something that people will pay for. And as an artist, as a photographer, as a creative who wants to earn a living, that's one way of doing it.
Yeah. And how did Andy Warhol see scarcity, and how, because he obviously reproduced a lot of his works, but how did he make sure it still retained its value despite that?
Yeah. Well, Warhol.
If you want to start your own podcast but have no idea where to start, and you want to generate viral social media clips and get your dream guests onto your show, even from just using your laptop in your bedroom like I did, then my Pro Remote Podcast Blueprint is exactly for you. It is a private paid course and community that has every single step and process I've used and continue to use to grow this show. And I include every single secret, every single tactic I do and still use that will get you results super fast. And also, if you want to access me personally every single week, then as part of this course, you'll also be able to join live weekly calls where I go through your podcast and answer your questions to get you results much, much faster. So if you want to actually start a podcast and stop dreaming and get millions of social media views and book your dream guests in half the amount of time it took me, then click the first link in the description. Let's get on to the rest of this episode.
Yeah, now there's a question. Hold on, let me think this through. So Warhol famously makes a lot of work. So after he's shot and sort of dies, the first die, he comes back to life and becomes a society portraitist. That's largely the work he does in the 70s. And he just creates a huge amount of work to the people who will commission him to pay the largest amount. And, and he creates works that are in a particular manner. There were some who portraits of very famous people. That suits me even better. So there's a series of Chairman Mao paintings, which proved to be quite controversial. In the way, now Warhol was very good at finding controversial things. And almost what's, I think, beautiful about Warhol is he just has an instinct for those things, and he's not trying that hard. He just has a brain that is always going to discover those things, because actually his way of appreciating things is different from that of most people. There's kind of neurodivergence that makes him quite an awkward character to sort of think about in some ways. But I mean, his thing is profusion, and so it's like in the with the Silver Factory, to delegate the creation of works, and also to have people living in the factory who are making films all the time. I don't know whether you've seen many of Warhol's 60s films. Sometimes they're quite difficult to find now because actually they're not properly licensed. This is the problem. And that for them to be shown, you need kind of the signatures of people who are actually in them. And so some of the stuff is quite difficult to get hold of now. But his interest was just in making more and more and more than you could ever have time to watch in your lifetime. And I think part of that was about trying to create an artistic society. I mean, obviously, it then is often called exploitative, and people feel that he did terrible things to his friends, and there was a lot of extreme behavior, including, of course, Valerie Solanas, shot, almost killed, did a terrible thing to Warhol. So, I mean, how did he actually make it pay, though? That's so. In the 70s, the way he made it pay was to have lots of clients who bought into the idea of having a Warhol. Now, having made himself famous, he did that, and he didn't much care, or from a sort of an art connoisseur's point of view, he didn't care enough about the work, they would say, because actually he was creating them for wealthy people to be able to show off their Warhol. In the 60s, he actually made less money initially, possibly even later into the decade, partly because of the way he diversified his output. But, in the 50s, when he first had his career, he was tremendously successful as an illustrator, and he created a lot of advertising work. And he also had some gallery shows. But actually, for quite some time, he did rather better as an illustrator, making work that went into magazines, than he did as a fine artist, where actually it was quite hard to sell work. In the early 60s, when, say, the soup cans were first shown, people look at them and they go, "Hmm." And, they look mechanical in there. They're not, because he comes out of abstract expressionism, and abstract expressionism is all about the touch of the artist. And, actually, what is it? Who knows? It's not about representation of things out there. And then Warhol goes to quite humble objects and paints them in a way that removes a lot of sort of the skill of the hand that is often the thing that's treasured by a certain kind of art collector. Whereas, I mean, he is a terrific illustrator, no question, but that he has that ability, but that's not the point. So actually, I don't think that initially, apart from just creating an awful lot of work, that he had much of a plan about how to make it pay. I think he delighted in madness of um, his sort of creative production line, because that's sort of what it was in the factory. And so you actually have people living in and they're making movies all the time. And he's he's the maker of a scene more than trying to become wealthy. And I forget what year it is in the 60s, but quite early on in the 60s, he declares that he's finished painting as well, at the point where he becomes famous as a painter, and says, I'm making films now. His films had never really, apart from Chelsea Girls, never really, and obviously there's the ones that, that are very famous now, of The Sleeping Figure and obviously Empire State Building. These very long views of things that are essentially unchanging. Whereas you sort of say, oh, creating films is all about cuts. It's all about the edit. It's all about variety and movement, and it's the moving image. And so he says, actually, it's all about the opposite. And then when people go out of, sort of leave early screenings of some of those films, he laughs about them and he goes, it's an endurance test. He's not necessarily interested in watching it himself or saying it was worth every frame of this. It's more, I don't know. He was good at japes, I think, Warhol. But yeah, so actually his model for making money was, I think, a bit hand to mouth. I mean, just sort of, let's just make as much as we can. And as I say, as I mentioned earlier, he's left this problem of authentication, where actually it's quite easy to copy his works. And because his production line was quite expanded, sort of proving that something is an original or whatever is quite difficult. So I don't think he was thinking about futurity in that way, as to how easy it would be for people to say, yes, this is definitely a Warhol, and this is not. This is 30% a Warhol. This is, but certainly one thing I particularly admire about him is that he does break most rules.
Yeah. And that leads me to ask, like, what inspired you to study him so much and write a whole biography on him? What other traits do you like about Warhol, and what fascinates you most about him?
So, I mean, what inspired me to write a book about him was that because publisher said, do you want to write a book about him? So, and that's often the way those things work when you start writing things. But actually, I do love Warhol a lot. And it was partly through writing this book, which is the one about copyright, because he says some of the most startlingly original things about the idea of copyright. And I think that's quite an interesting area. If you're working as a creative person, and actually you just go around exploding a lot of the sort of shibboleths of what that is, that's worth thinking about. So, right. So I'll tell you. Should I tell you this? So one of the first books I wrote was this called Bang in the Middle, which is actually a sort of travel book. It wasn't intended to be a travel. I am from Mansfield in Midlands, North Nottinghamshire. And one thing I used to sort of was very aware of was that nobody had heard of Mansfield. Actually, more people have heard of Mansfield now because in recent years it's sort of come up the agenda a bit in terms of national news for various reasons. But sort of, you come from nowhere in particular. It's not the north, it's not the south, it's the Midlands. Actually, it's a very northern bit of. And so the idea with this book was to write something that would prove that everything started in the Midlands. That was the idea. That was specifically the project. And I think I did it. Everything begins in the Midlands, it turns out, from this book. And I did that I think once it was a discovery in myself that I was both very passionate about doing this because I really believed in it. And at the same time, I thought it was a total joke and I didn't mean it at all. And I thought, oh, if that's the way I actually feel about, I'm capable of feeling that about lots of things. It's not to say that I don't actually have any, serious or sincere feelings about anything, but actually to be really serious about something and at the same time to go, oh, and so to have a project like that. And I think when I sort of uh, think about Warhol, um, he's quite like that. So two connections then to Warhol. One is one of the first things I loved about Warhol was the work he inspired um, by other people, because I suppose he died when I was still quite, actually he was only in his mid to late 50s when he died. So sort of vast body of work um, is extraordinary in somebody who didn't make it out of middle age. And he, of course, was the manager of Velvet Underground. Do you know Velvet Underground? Do you like Velvet Underground?
Um, I like one or two of their songs. I tried to get into them a little bit. Yeah.
And also, he made films with he shot films of them performing, and also loads of photographs. You should look at them. I mean, it's amazing. And of course, he caused complete havoc. He was the one who said to Lou Reed, "Well, Lou, you're going to have another singer, and I've met this woman Nico, and she's going to sing the songs, right?" Lou Reed is very put out by this, um, but on some of those songs, like "I'll Be Your Mirror" or whatever, if they'd been sung by Lou Reed, they wouldn't be the same. So it's kind of genius, but also mischief making in doing that. So hold on, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So when Warhol died, um, the diaries were published. The diaries, which were actually sort of dictated to Pat Hackett, who is sort of responsible for quite a lot of the books published in Warhol's name. And so she significantly shaped the diaries. The diaries are brilliant. Lou Reed thought they were not to quote words from the album that he made with John Cale, who was the other sort of key creative force in Velvet Underground, are not a worthy epitaph, he said. Whereas actually, I think it is a worthy epitaph, but that's another matter. So he created this collection of songs called Songs for Drummer. And the first song on the album is called Small Town. And it's about growing up in a small town that nobody's ever heard of, and all you want to do is, okay, I know about that feeling. And of course, lots of people know about that feeling. So for me, that built a bridge to Warhol. And it was sort of a loving tribute from Lou Reed, who obviously had very mixed feelings at the same time, but it's a very beautiful work. And then I think another thing that with Warhol is people worry about a certain kind of work that, for instance, he created this very startling series of works around the civil rights movement and some political works. There's a portrait of Nixon, and then around the electric chair as well. And then he does them in different colorways. And so he highly aestheticizes it. They're still very disturbing images. And sometimes people will say, well, but he didn't really care about civil rights movement, or he didn't, actually his politics, was he really a Democrat? Was this a criticism of Nixon? Or, why didn't he do a portrait of McGovern instead? Um, and it's that sort of what I quite like about him as an artist is that actually he's not telling you what to think. Um, and it's possible that, he's thinking through composition and color and being attracted to something and not necessarily always saying to himself, why am I attracted to this? What is it about? So, say the civil rights images come out of photojournalistic pictures, and he adopts them in a way that you might find slightly uncomfortable, and that's fine. All of these responses are possible and right in some degree, but what he does is is then turn it into something that sort of defies a final summation, in my view. And I think that's one reason why they last, because they're not trying to force through this policy or have a celebration of, the electric chair. What is he doing with that? I mean, they're very stark images.
It almost leaves the conclusion to be decided by the individual who's looking at it.
Yeah. And this is generally how art, I mean, I won't say great art, because I mean, I suppose, although it's the definition of great art, which is art that survives. And um, I started out studying literature and was particularly interested in the stage and sort of 16th and 17th century stage. And Shakespeare is the great example of this, because actually, one reason why Shakespeare has survived, there's the language, obviously. And partly that's, I mean, his genius, but also luck of being there, of having that genius at the moment where the language is expanding in that way and the stage is new and it's all to be done. And so there's a very particular kind of conjunction of things that happen that make him possible. But actually, one thing that makes him really survive is that those plays are often made to mean diametric opposites in different productions. And actually, he was a Midlander, so he gets quite a bit in this. And I put that down as a Midland quality. I don't know why, because it's just I wanted to prove everything comes from the Midlands. But it's that quality of you create something that can be adopted and adapted by a later age, and it can mean so this or it can be that. So some of his history plays, for instance, like Henry V, have been used as sort of great patriotic statements. And equally, say at the time of various sort of conflicts in Iraq, I saw productions where they were being used to say exactly the opposite, and yet it's the same words with the same kind of resonant phrasing. They're still written by him, but they can be made to mean this, that, or something else. I mean, I suppose you could sometimes say that's a failing because we don't know what it means. But actually, maybe a certain kind of creativity is great and really catches us because it doesn't have to mean in that way. Like the songs that you want to keep singing, is it because they mean a precise thing, or is it?
Well, it leaves it open for debate as well, which means conversations about it last, because if people are still arguing about what it means hundreds of years later, that keeps it in the society's kind of mind throughout time. So that probably helps it.
Yeah, and did Shakespeare think to himself, "I must leave this open," or is it just a quality of mind that he has? And say in the case of Warhol, I'm fairly certain it's just a quality of mind that he had, where actually he just wasn't interested in saying, "I believe this," whatever. It was more, "I think this looks great," uh, which maybe that's something you should be critical of. I don't know, but I personally find that quite intriguing. And it does mean that lots of different people can look at things and find different things in them. And I don't think there's anything so terrible about that, because it allows everybody to stand in front of the same picture and have it resonate for them without saying, "I'm on this side, I'm on the other side." So I like that, but
I agree. I agree. You've mentioned you're from the Midlands, and
yeah.
you made a book about it to kind of champion it and in a kind of playful but also serious way. And I agree with the kind of jokey, playful side of things. I think it's good to also be serious about your work, but also have fun doing it. And by having fun, you're kind of playing, and it's kind of a joke at the same time. And it's almost stoic in the sense that if you see it as kind of a half joke, you're not too upset by the outcome of it. And a lot of the time, the outcome's out of your control. So, but I just wanted to know why there's this. From where I'm from, or from the UK, online, there seems to be this reputation about the Midlands. I was wondering why the Midlands has a kind of negative reputation, and what are your arguments against that?
Uh, well, I mean, my argument against it is that, everything that we're grateful for in daily life began in the Midlands, and without the Midlands, there'd be nothing. Uh, just wasteland. And that's my principal argument for that. See how good I am at not taking things too seriously. I mean, there's partly it's the name. Um, because actually, I mean, at all times we like polar opposite and, you know, antitheses. And so that's north and south. Uh, North-south divide, which is the main way we think about the country in that way. Bit east-west, mostly north-south. Um, and the Midlands is, although I managed to find actually it wasn't me, it was somebody else who suggested it again, the actual phrase bang in the middle. It's one of the very few sort of positive phrases that feature the word middle, because usually it's stuck in the middle. Or, oh, that's very middling. Oh, she's a middle manager. You know, the word middle is not one that is generally very positive. Centre, if it had been called the Centrelands, now then, everybody would be going crazy for Northampton, today. Whereas, as a result, it's so easy to overlook. So part of it is in the name. I mean, it's an island we live on, obviously, and Midland by name, Midland by nature. We have no shoreline officially, and that sort of takes the Midlands out of quite a lot of British history as well, because so much of British history, obviously, before the most recent period, is determined by the sea, because it's where food comes in. If you want the best fish, you're not going to get it in the Midlands. If you are part of, the fleet that defends country, you're not going to be in the Midlands. None of these things happen in the Midlands. So I suppose in that sense, it's the opposite of adventurous because it's stuck in the middle. Uh, there are so many reasons, but then there's the other thing, which is just where are the powerful centers of production? In actual fact, in the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the places of production are in the Midlands. The factories are there, but all the writing about it gets done in London, and then Manchester, the Manchester Guardian, and further north. And actually, Manchester is fairly Midland. When you look at a map of the UK, Manchester is not very far north. But part of Manchester's genius, if I can call it that, and I don't really want to, but obviously it's been smart in certain ways, is actually to be part of the north rather than to allowing itself to fall below the borderline there. So a lot of it is just in naming. It's also that it's to do with distance from London. Whereas if you are at a certain distance, you are far enough away not to be influenced in the same way. Whereas the Midlands is essentially a band that allows you to get to London since, fairly earlyish part of the 19th century in a couple of hours. So it's going to be very much influenced by that. And you don't really have a separation that makes you distinct. So there are lots of reasons, but, mostly not enough broadcasters, not enough publishers.
Yeah. And what would you say for those who are critical of the Midlands, and what are some kind of cool places to visit that might change their opinion of it?
I say this as somebody who's lived in us for quite a long time, but I do go back. I do go back a lot. So, okay, so actually early art, Cresswell Crags, in the Ice Age, some of the earliest cave art, I'm right in saying, in the British Isles is there, just above Mansfield, as it so happens. Tremendous site, it's really well worth a visit. And actually, something new was done here that linked us also to a greater European tradition. It happened in the Midlands, so definitely that. What else do you have to? That's often called the sort of Sistine Chapel of the Ice Age. I say it's often called that. I think I called it that, but I think I must have been quoting it because I just wouldn't have had the imagination to make up something quite that cheeky, I think. What else? Obviously, you have to go and see Nottingham Forest play when I was growing up. Brian Clough was the manager. That was a great moment. This unbelievable thing where suddenly Midland clubs were winning what was the first division at the time, and then the European Cup 2 years in a row. I mean, that was crazy. So, hold on. It's a while since I wrote this book, so I have to just look at it again. Foodstuffs. We have all sorts of foodstuffs. So, pork pies. Did you know? Stilton. What do I say? Oh, Chatsworth. You've got to go to Chatsworth. That's very nice. The Crags. Well, Shakespeare birthplace, Stratford-upon-Avon. Quite interesting, actually, that the whole thing about the Shakespeare controversy, the authorship controversy, begins at the moment when people first visit Stratford-upon-Avon and realize that Shakespeare was from there. I mean, literally. So it's a late 18th century thing where there is a festival, and it's Boswell, Johnson's biographer, goes to it and writes about it. And people go there, and it's at that moment that people begin to say, actually, I think those works were not really written by this man from the Midlands, because how would somebody from there ever have written this? And you might say it was, because actually the Shakespeare that we know about historically is not supposed to have been highly educated or known people in government. So how did he know these things? But a lot of it was just, they got to the West Midlands and they went, there's no genius that's come from it. No way. It's the Earl of Oxford who wrote it, really, or that guy, Christopher Marlowe, who was a Southerner. Maybe it was him, but definitely not somebody from the Midlands. So you should go to Stratford just to go and think about what happened when people went to it was the Jubilee, and first went, there is no way that this man, a man from here, wrote these works. So, what else? Well, there's so much there, but I mean, Birmingham. I'm from the East Midlands, so I'm in favour of the East Midlands. But the East Midlands is quite a harsh. There's Robin Hood, of course, but he didn't really exist, or did he? I mean, and was he actually from Yorkshire, really? In which case, he was a North. And all everything gets stolen again in terms of beg, steal, and borrow. Everything gets stolen from the Midlands. In that, no doubt, Hoodie, as we know him locally in Mansfield. My mother and father are buried very close to Will Scarlett in a graveyard in Blidworth. So, clearly he did exist, and he was from North. But I think there was an airport in Doncaster, which is in Yorkshire, was named after Robin Hood, and a general attempt to sort of make sure that he's really from Barnsley, I think. So everybody's tried to steal from the Midlands, and then, of course, D.H. Lawrence and everything he wrote about. I think Philip Larkin said that, whatever. Anyway, D.H. Lawrence, lots of everything. Everything began there. Gawain and the Green Knight. I could go on. I do go on. That's the other thing. I just do. But no, the Midlands it's also the equivalent I've sort of discovered of what are called the flyover states in the US. So, I mean, you get a similar thing. So it's New York, it's California, East and West Coast, and people just go over the bit in between. If they can, they fly over and they don't have to think about it too much. And people are, it's always that sort of thing about they're picking hay from their ears and from between their teeth. So there is this very disparaging attitude generally to people from the middle. It's not just in English culture. And I'll specify English there because obviously the Midlands is the middle of England rather than, actually when you look at a map of the UK, as I say, the middle of it would stretch quite a lot further up, and it wouldn't necessarily begin at Northampton, which is where it does. I mean, one of my it was when it was sort of going into middle age and thinking about trying to explain to a child what the Midlands was and what their inheritance would be as a Midlander that got me doing this, and driving up and down the M1 and discovering that there are signs all the way up and down for the north and the south. And the Midlands, I think, is mentioned twice, even though most of the motorway is in the Midlands. So even when you're in the Midlands, they're trying to sell you the north, they're trying to sell you the south.
Well, you make a compelling argument, and I will be sure to visit especially Stratford-upon-Avon. And I haven't been to Nottingham actually. I do want to go there.
I think Nottingham is quite a nice and highly pedestrianised, quite a lot of things to do, and you can walk around it quite easily.
Isn't
Um,
there like a pub that's connected to an old castle, so like one of the oldest pubs in
yeah,
the
in actual
UK?
fact, I think it's a good place for a drink. Mansfield. I think 2 or 3 of the oldest pubs, or of the pubs that claim to be the oldest uh, in England and then in the world, are around Nottingham Castle. The trip to Jerusalem,
Yeah, yeah,
and there was another one. I forgot the name. But yes, yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And how does growing up in the Midlands how's that influenced your life and career? You said you've moved down to London. Now, have you always felt like an outsider coming from Midlands to London, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think I ended up writing a book about Midlands and then making some radio. I mean, it became my life for a little while. Um, was that sort of sense of when you moved around the country, people not really understanding where you're from. And of course, this is a familiar experience for a lot of people. Suggest only that, but actually, when you say it's in the Midlands, and I was very insistent, or I think I always thought of it as the Midlands because I was um, young during the miners' strike of the night. And there was this very strong line that was drawn between Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, and the North Midlands by the fact that uh, the Nottinghamshire miners did not come out on strike, even though quite a lot of them did stop work, but officially they didn't, whereas the Yorkshire miners did. And so there were a lot of kind of pitched battles, and it's quite an unhappy history. But it made, and there were a lot of. I come from a town that is often called a scab town in those terms, and for years afterwards, and probably still today, actually, I haven't been to the matches of quite that kind recently, but that Mansfield, say, would be chanted against as a scab town by, say, the Sheffield. Um, so I think that really marked me as being not from the north, despite coming really close, actually, about as far north as you can go in the Midlands without being in the north. So I think it was a political thing that really said, we're obviously not part of the South either, because people would laugh at that. And I don't know. So yeah, I think sort of feeling that you come from somewhere in between. But I know an awful lot of people from the Midlands who don't feel that particular way. So it must be individual psychology as well as, and then you've got this particular context which you make a particular thing of, and other people just don't feel that way about it. Um, but but I suppose it gave me at a certain moment an ambition to want to be proud of where I was from. And then I thought, laugh, isn't it? And then dropped it. But I mean, and I would urge anybody from anywhere to do exactly the same project with where from, because it's also a way of drawing lines to everywhere else in the world. It's a way of seeing the connectedness of everything too. Because actually, yeah, I forgot to mention that. It turns out that the Midlands and Mansfield in particular invented America, because um, the
How do they invent America?
you know, Jacob, I mean,
No,
come
I
on.
don't.
So the sort of Pilgrim Fathers were in large part from an area around Mansfield, and then they went to the Netherlands and then ended up as the people on the Mayflower. So it was a particular kind of nonconformism within the church. But actually, so although they ended up going from Plymouth, and then there's Plymouth Rock in the US, and they took a lot of cultural attitudes from uh, Britain, but they were actually, you know, an expression of the North Midlands, I'm going to say, tendentiously, but it's true in some degree, and it goes into the sort of founding fathers myth of the US and the land of the free. And actually, I do think, for better and for worse at times, that notion, I mean, because it's there in Robin Hood as well, actually. He's both a socialist, robs from the rich to give to the poor, so redistribution of wealth, but he is also actually a libertarian, isn't he? Because he goes to live in the woods. He doesn't, you know what I mean? He doesn't want to build a society, even though he sort of nourishes the society. He doesn't actually want to be part of it. And I think that's quite an interesting kind of, that's a very East Midlands kind of mythos. Um, may have some truth, no truth. Who knows?
Yeah. And Warhol came from Pittsburgh, which is, I assume, a bit of a flyover state. It's not obscure, it's the steel capital of the US, or was,
Right.
but he often lied about where he came from, didn't he? What's the reason for that? Why did he not want to admit his Pittsburgh roots when he was
Yeah.
younger?
I mean, I think I think that a lot of people find, and maybe it's going to change slightly in the digital age, but not that much, maybe, is that, you need to, in order to be an artist, in order to be journalist or whatever, to do certain things at scale or at a certain level, you sort of need to be in centers of power, because that's where the galleries are, that's where the collectors are, and that's where the publishing houses are. And so he had that. I mean, his what was he doing when, I don't know whether have you ever watched on YouTube? There are some brilliant TV interviews where he appeared with Edie Sedgwick on TV. Um, one of which I put in my new graphic novel, which is partly about Warhol, is sort of powered by Warhol. And it is a really beautiful book, actually. And I can say that because I didn't draw it. Um, it was by Eva Rossetti, who's, I think, done a really lovely job. So it is quite an exciting thing to look at. And that's not my bit. Um, but Warhol, so I mean, he sort of stands at the beginning of the mass media age in many ways, in that suddenly there is TV in most homes. And so he ends up as an artist, as somebody who's been an illustrator, who then does this thing with Campbell's soup cans and Brillo boxes, who decides to, who becomes a media figure. And his way of dealing with that is largely by saying nothing or not telling the truth. And it's done by Bob Dylan at the same time. So it sort of belongs to a particular moment as well. That they're both really interesting individuals psychologically. But there's that sort of, you have a moment where suddenly everybody is asking you questions, and and there is a kind of guru status that goes with it. They expect extreme wisdom and whatever. And actually, you just, Andy would just say, gee, I don't know. What do you think? And, he'll say things like, I'm feeling really empty today. Do you want to, maybe you could tell me what to say? And of course, that's partly his way of making work as well. It's a sort of a hive mind thing, which is, tell you what, I'm doing some research here. You talk for me, and that you could be my voice. Um, and he does this with, I don't know whether you've read any of his books. I really love the Diaries.
I've read the philosophy, which was quite
Have you?
yeah, quite confusing. I was going to say I've when I read a lot of biographies, and whenever I do, I'm normally left with the impression that I kind of understand the person. Yeah, that one. Yeah, I understand the person and their kind of mindset. But reading about Andy Warhol, I was left just as kind of confused about his character in a positive way, but
Yes.
also a kind of curious way than before I read it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really great book. I love this book. I think it is a book that you sort of need to read a few times, because it is quite, I mean, the way it's put together, it's almost as though it's written by several different people who are not talking to one another at all times. And that is actually what happened. It's actually Pat Hackett, who is credited as the editor of the Warhol Diary, is one of the significant writers, and basically surrounds himself by people who will pastiche him and sort of do something in the manner of Andy Warhol. And then you end up with a book that is quite confusing, because actually it's not a coherent sort of statement from a single individual. If any individual can even achieve coherence, I mean, who knows? But, you know, um, it's not, it's actually not done in that way. But I think it is an amazingly rich book. And so there's also this book, Popism, um, which is his account of the 60s, essentially. But again, a lot of it's written by Pat Hackett, you know, talking to Andy. And, you know, Andy Warhol really loved signing copies of this one. That was his big thing. And he was interested in commercialism, actually, which is a very, artists aren't supposed to talk about that. They're supposed to know how to build a career, but without being too obsessed by that. But actually, yeah, we were talking earlier about how to make money. He was very interested in, certainly by the 70s, in how to, turn a buck. But that was partly because actually he was less successful in the 60s.
Yeah. And why do people like Bob Dylan and Andy Warhol have that kind of, almost, I'd describe it as detached persona in the public when they're being interviewed, for example? And that might seem like a negative thing, but I think in a way it almost makes them more sought after because they're kind of mysterious and you want to get to know a bit more about them. Why? What is it, like a purposeful thing, or is it something they just, is it natural, or do they put it on
I
to
mean,
show?
I think that in the case of Warhol and Dylan, that it is interesting that they sort of both discover this technique at about the same time. That it's a response to a fairly new phenomenon, culture, which is partly invented by them, and certainly invented at that moment, comes into being. They both obviously have highly unusual minds. Um, I mean, neither of them can have had much foresight about how long it would go on. Um, in that they're doing some stuff, early rock and roll and pop at the moment, and sort of expectation in the early 60s and even going into the 70s that, your career would last 3 singles and then 3 years and whatever. So the idea that Dylan is thinking, I'm still going to be around in 2025. How do I string this out? It's kind of, well, it's a way of dealing with a certain kind of celebrity and visibility, and just being accessible to so many people. So I don't think it can have been. I don't think they came up with it with a publicist. Put it that way. I think it was a kind of, we've got a great marketing plan for you. Thought about how to do your PR, because at various times, it's fairly disastrous.
Yeah. And Warhol kind of seemed to purposely make these kind of personas, though, in some situations, like was it like Baggy Andy or Brown Bag Andy, where he would come in all kind of like helpless and people would be sympathise him. What were some of the advantages and reasonings behind that from what you've found out about him?
I mean, it's really so. Yeah, this is when he's trying to sell his work as an illustrator, doing the rounds of the magazine. It was extremely successful for him. I mean, maybe to try and garner a little bit of sympathy. Um, he's very he's difficult to read, Warhol, famously. And as to exactly what his motives were and how he managed to, what was his emotional life? Actually, it's quite interesting question, and you can sort of think about it a lot. And you can see, say, in the diaries that he really suffers for want of love at various points in his life. Um, he appears to be quite a serious Catholic at the end of his life, and yet you wouldn't think of him as a religious artist most of the time. Um, I think one of the things that makes his life and his sort of output so rich is actually how much it can take, without being very determinedly this or that. Uh, and so, I mean, sort of the Warhol, he wanted people to take pity on him and to commission work from him in the 50s. In the 60s, to maintain a certain mystery and to sort of make other people into superstars out of the Silver Factory. So it, it's an interview, a TV interview that is easily searchable on YouTube, where he appears with Edie Sedgwick and gets her to do all the talking. Um, and of course, a lot of those people who are around him at that time who he uses in that way become very unhappy because they don't become superstars despite his sort of promise, and many die quite young, including Edie. So is that sort of exploitative? Is that just self-protection on his part? He's because he's quite he's a kind of countercultural figure at the moment of really hyped up society where everybody's taking amphetamines. That I mean that actually he's up all the time, but sort of amphetamines are an awful lot of prescription drugs as well for and sort of things you can buy over the counter for people just to keep themselves going. It's before it gets stripped out of that. And so you have quite a sort of speedy society. And the silver factory is really built on people who don't sleep and who just make and make and make and make. I mean, it's like a really highly industrialized society. But it is countercultural, and it's just before flower power, and it doesn't have. Whereas flower power is a real alternative society. It's that is the counterculture. Warhol has this much smaller counterculture first, and which is much harder to read. It's more contained, more creative, more dangerous, and again, the one thing it doesn't have, unlike flower power, the culture at the end of the 60s, is any particular values. And I think, part of his hiding from interviewers is also he didn't have, or did he? I mean, did he seriously have very strong opinions that he just managed to hide for so long? Or, I don't know. And in the case of Dylan, all of that goes into, he writes songs. And so there is this tremendous expressive capacity, but actually it's expressed in this other way. And, in Chronicles, there's been quite a lot of, which is his first memoir. Yeah. But, in that, quite a bit of research has been done into that, and that actually quite a lot of it is sort of him writing about his own things that people have said about how things happened in his life, rather than suddenly saying, this is really what happened. And just not wanting to engage with a certain kind of sincerity, honesty, because again, unlike certain, say, political processes where you might want to say, look, it is really important that we know who said what and how we arrived at this, and actually what are the figures, what are the statistics, and what happened as a result of this, and we must be transparent and we shouldn't blur that. In terms of somebody talking about their own feelings in an artistic context, why is there a duty on them to be honest or to be clear? And also, most of us often aren't very clear about what we think or feel much of the time.
Yeah.
And yeah.
For Dylan, he was, from reading Chronicles, he was constantly had a label put on him about the voice of a generation, a revolutionary, which he completely disagreed with. And maybe because the interviewers maybe already had a preconception about him that he didn't believe was true, he just couldn't be bothered to even engage with it. And I remember reading in The Philosophy of Andy Warhol a similar, not kind of similar thing, where he would say like, oh, I would just try and say what the interviewer wanted me to say, because they were going to say it anyway, because they came in with basically a preconceived opinion of me. So do you think that's another reason why they acted the way they did in interviews and public life?
Yeah. I mean, in the case of Dylan, there was that thing about as a folk singer, that thing about you're a protest songwriter, and him going, no, I'm not. That's not what I mean at all. And then people really wanting that, and then going electric, and sort of tremendous sense that he'd let people down, and he's going, no, they haven't. You're wrong. And I forget which poetry it is. There's a really tremendous account of when he goes on tour and people are booing every night.
Yeah.
And he appears to actually take an energy from that, from actually not wanting people to, what the Scorsese.
Have you seen the video? It's on YouTube. I don't know if it's in Manchester somewhere. In regards to what you're saying, someone shouts Judas, and then he's like, just just says to his band, play it fucking loud. And then you just see the energy he gets from that crowd reaction just fuels the entire song. It's just amazing to watch.
Yeah. And sometimes that kind of energy, and I think, obviously he's, anything's very obvious about Dylan, but clearly at that moment, he quite, uh, there's something about that friction that is actually quite creative for him. And as you say, that's a very beautiful moment, yeah, where he says, okay, then let's really give it to them then. Okay. And I really love him for that, actually. I have to say, I find that really attractive. So I don't care.
It's kind of interesting, but also kind of funny, in the sense that he seems so he's portrayed himself as so averse to public attention, especially later in his career, when people were coming to his house and like breaking in. He couldn't do anything about it, and he just wanted to escape all of it. And in his autobiography, he reminisces of all he wanted when he started a family. All he wanted was this kind of not a 9 to 5 job and a white picket fence. Obviously, that might just be him in the moment. He doesn't really mean that in the long term. But the fact that he seemed to be so against all of it and not wanting it and just wanting to write songs and perform songs, yet in 2025 we're still here talking about him, and there's a movie just come out about him. Is it's just how does that work? Why is someone who seems so against being famous? And maybe it's a similar case for Warhol. I know Warhol really enjoyed or wanted fame, but how do these kind of outliers and people deal with fame once they get it? For example, what have you learned from studying Warhol? What was his reaction to becoming famous, especially maybe later on in his career? Did it change to when he first wanted to become successful?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, he lives in a very rapidly changing society, sort of get the real 60s with Warhol, swinging 60s, as we would call them here, but where that thing kind of kicks up after the assassination of President Kennedy and Beatlemania in the US. And he is obviously very interested in being famous, but and I'm going to show this very nice chapters of Lower, begins with his wounds from being shot by Valerie Solanas. And there are some famous photographs of it. And so his attitude to fame changes radically with the attempt to kill him. And the fact that it really did have a massive impact on his health. He never recovered. And it did change him. So before that, he had complete open house. And there are brilliant songs on Songs for Drella by Lou Reed and Cale that evoke that as well. And that he then, with the turn into the 70s, wants to be, or he chooses a different kind of fame, which is to be seen alongside very famous people. And rather than, whereas in the 60s, he's trying to find people who are also outsiders, and the people who end up living in the factory, sort of superstars that he tries to create. These are generally people who are quite marginal in society. And in the 70s, not that he doesn't like those people anymore, but he's more nervous about being around them because who knows what's going to happen. And obviously he's defined really by socializing and his desire to meet everybody. And he wants to meet the Pope, and there's a very good story in the Diaries where he goes to see the Pope, but then he thinks that one of the nuns might be about to assassinate him, and so she looks a bit like Valerie Solanas again. He's quite funny. Whether it's always intentional humor, I don't know. So his attitude to fame, I mean, obviously, one, he doesn't think that, he talks about people being famous for 15 minutes. Obviously, his own fame has lasted rather than longer than that. I don't know. I mean, again, it's that sort of desire to have other people speak for him that means it's quite hard to know what he felt about anything. There are sort of images of Warhol um, later on where he has a very beautiful townhouse in Manhattan, and he likes to go antiquing and going stores to buy things, and he'll just collect endlessly, and then he goes home, and he often doesn't even take them out of the bag when he gets home. And he's just sort of, he has all these projects for also, burying items and time capsules. And I mean, he's sort of more of a doer than a beer. You know what I mean? That he's defined more by activity than by stillness and sort of meditative. So it's sort of what he says fame, but did he actually even, did he actually say the thing about 15 minutes? No.
Yeah. And in regards to his death, I've read that um, the nurse checked on Warhol, and then sometime later, too long after, he was found dead. Have you uncovered anything from studying Warhol about the final kind of days of his life?
No. No. I mean, I think in the end, although it's quite as so often with well-known figures where there appears to be some kind of mystery around their death. The truth is he really did have a problem with his gallbladder. I absolutely desperately didn't want to go into hospital for it the longest time. And he was quite ill, and it's not, so the sort of the terrible thing is his fear of hospital meant that he didn't seek treatment for it earlier on. It's kind of miraculous, and I think that would have been his line in some degree, that he lived on beyond the assassination attempt in the late 60s. And so sort of everything else is a gift from the gods that you have with Warhol. Uh, and so in a way, it's more the miracle that he survived what happened then than that he died in such an odd, unannounced way. Just sort of, he goes into hospital, has a fairly routine looking operation, and doesn't survive it. I don't think there was foul play, put it that way. Was it? Could he have received better treatment? He could certainly have sought out uh, maybe more serious treatment for himself at an earlier stage.
Well, yeah, it kind of stems back to him being shot, but also his phobia of hospitals. Wasn't that kind of partly influenced from his dad dying quite early and his mother being ill as well?
Yeah, and so he has this kind of deep rooted. That's not going to help when you actually have something where you do need serious medical attention. I think he tried to treat himself with crystals for a long time. It's just uh, at that point his sort of playfulness is maybe not helpful.
And
That's
wasn't
where it
he?
goes wrong.
Yeah, it's almost like same as similar to Steve Jobs. When he was first diagnosed with cancer, he put off like treatment for 9 months because he was trying some alternative medical techniques that just clearly didn't work. It's just
Yeah,
sad, really, because you
it's
never know what could have happened if people like that got treatment.
yeah, yeah. Well, these things are tricky, but then they become part of the legend, don't they? So
Wasn't Warhol pronounced dead when he got shot, and then the surgery was, like you said, almost a miracle because the odds were so low of him surviving?
certainly that's the way it's been reported consistently. That actually there was what was it when he was actually in the ambulance? It was only when somebody said, "Well, look, he's famous," that actually there was even an attempt to revive him, um, because actually he seemed so far gone that it just seemed a pointless thing to do. And I think yes, he's supposed to have been pronounced dead, uh, but he was quite resilient despite being quite sort of frail looking. obviously had quite a life force. This weird kind of, well, I don't know way, I don't know. What do you think? Why don't you speak for me?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think, sort of, and he kind of has two lives as an artist. There's up to the moment where assassinated, there is an attempt on his life, and then there's the after, where, and he's much criticized by the people who'd seen him as a revolutionary in the 60s for doing a lot of society portraits. But actually, a lot of what he does is quite subversive then, and a lot of it looks great as well. And in the end, an artist who begins as an illustrator and they create a lot of work that looks great.
Yeah. And under the description of your book on one of the websites, it said that after Warhol, nothing would be the same. He changed art forever. Was it you who said that? Was it you who wrote that?
I think that was probably the marketing department who wrote
Do you
that.
think?
I don't
Yeah.
know. I
Because
think so. I mean, for the most part, I have to say nothing is ever the same after anything. I mean, that is, and yet in the way that nothing is original, nothing's ever changed either. But I mean, he lives through a moment where so much is changing. He is himself a great adopter of new technology. He says at one point he starts carrying around obviously a camera and also recording device uh, called Sony, which he refers to as his wife, and he wants to just keep everything, but actually all the time making everything and deciding afterwards how to use it. Um, and so I suppose he does live through a period of great change. And of course, there are lots of periods of great change, but he is somebody who is quite keen to keep abreast of that. So, in the early 80s, he does quite a lot of TV, but where it's his, they're his broadcasts, and he's very keen on doing that. And so, if he'd lived on into the digital age, he would no doubt have adopted all sorts of things and done something quite quirky with a lot of it, I think. Done. I don't know. I mean, he was very much ahead of the kind of iPhone selfie moment in that, he photographs almost everything in his life. Everything is documented uh, well before this becomes something that technology enables for everybody.
yeah, I'm sure his Instagram would have been full of thousands of just photo dumps if he was
Yeah.
alive today.
Or would he have gone the other way instead? I mean, who knows? Because it was always about being vanguard in his use of things. So actually, yes, what would he have done? But I mean, I think his work um, has that. I mean, he's that kind of artist who does change the way you think about art. Whereas there are other artists who, in a more modest way, make you think of it. Say, if you think about, say, Lucien Freud as a portraitist. Okay, great work, uh, amazing catalogue of work, and it might change your ideas about art. The end, and nothing is quite the same in terms of how portraits might be painted afterwards, but it's not really working on that bigger scale. Whereas Warhol is involved in lots of projects that have much greater visibility and also interact with society more, like being the manager and the producer of Velvet Underground. And actually, how much he really got to do with what happened with Velvet Underground? I mean, I don't know, but he stands there and certainly, isn't the first album great, and isn't the cover great, and isn't, the cover of Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. So have you seen that? And the original has the zipper in it. Do you know this?
I'm not. I don't.
Look
Rings
it
a
up.
bell. It rings a bell.
Look it up. And of
Yeah, I
course,
will.
what's brilliant about it, his design, one, is way too expensive, so they have to drop it quite quickly because it has an actual zipper built into the 12-inch sleeve. And also the other thing is it does, when they're stacked, which you do with obviously vinyl, is it warps the, the record. I mean, so but, you know, um, and he sort of interacts with so many, partly through coming out of illustration, through wanting to make money. I mean, he likes the idea of making money. I'm not sure he has a plan for how to control his image as such, but He needs to make money. And so I suppose in that sense, it's something you can say of Warhol that other artists don't demand in quite the same way, that actually, yes, a lot of things really are changed. And the way he works really asks a lot of questions about actually just how you think of the production of art and the meaning of art and how to view it and how to collect it and how to, make it into a coherent statement and how to think about a life, how to think. He's so I think he's good in that way. And one thing, one reason certainly I've really enjoyed becoming immersed in Warhol is how rich the output is, how much of it there is, and that you can go back to things and find very different things. There are writings as well as all of terrific painting. Personally, I really love the '60s films, as far as you can get to see them. Um, Velvet Underground, insofar as that's got much to do with him, but he does introduce Nico to them, that's for sure. Um, and then he's the inspiration for Songs for Drama, which is one of my favorite things. So I think he does have that sort of wider impact, that bigger impact, just through of his way of being.
Let's speak about your new book, Blow Up. It's a graphic novel chronicling contemporary art history. Am I correct?
Exactly. So actually, is it a graphic novel or a graphic history? I've just seen this term graphic history is also used. Uh, so, and it does look great. And mentioned before, it's because it's drawn by somebody else, Eva Rosset, who is terrific and illustrate job. Yeah, and it's interesting to do something in this way. So I was asked to write. The commission was to write a history of contemporary art, really based on conceptual art. Uh, so the last 100 years, from Duchamp's Urinal through to decided to end it with Maurizio Catalan and his duct taping of a banana wolf. So it's kind of art by alternative means. But then sort of it's really interesting to do a project like this because and I think it's quite a challenge, which is if it looks like a comic, can it be a serious history? And actually, the facts should be correct, and it is supposed to be engaging in a way that something that is highly visual should be. It sort of forces you to use different things. You can't use a lot of long words because it has to go into speech bubbles. So, you can't do it. You can't become, I mean, I've never been much of a fan of jargon anyway. I don't like it really in writing about anything because it usually obfuscates rather than really clarifies what's going on. But in doing this sort of a way of trying to do an art history, but doing it through sequenced images where people have to speak. And so there's also, it's a factual history, but you have to create characters in order to tell the stories because Yayoi Kusama is in there and sort of tells her own story, which is something she's done. But then with other people, in order to sort of tell this history of the '80s in New York with Keith Haring, Basquiat, and Warhol in there, you sort of have to create other people who can put them together. Because I mean, otherwise, how do you write about a larger movement without making up a bit of the sort of narrative framework in order to do that? So that was an interesting thing to do, and say to have Marina Abramovich done by a YouTuber who is a fan. I consider myself somebody who really likes Marina Abramovich and who tends to get a certain kind of loyalty from people who like her work, which is a bit beyond kind of just I love the art. It's more belief in a person and in their sort of ritual presence in a way. Um, so it was a way of trying to capture all of that. But it's fun. I can see from sort of early things that have been said about it that yes, it's hard to sort of know how to take it in a way. It begins on the battlefield, First World War, with somebody doing a traditional landscape painting amidst the bombs, which is kind of where Dada begins, because this sort of idea of the world is mad, and the work we create within that mad world is actually kind of stage representational art. So, hey, how about if instead we put a urinal in a gallery and call it fountain and see what happens? So the thread of it is about this alternative. So there are almost no painters. It's not about traditional forms because, Duchamp is himself a very good painter, actually. He has quite a reputation. Sort of cubism and those movements. So he's very much sort of vanguard in that way, and then suddenly breaks it, sort of smashes the model entirely, and becomes a chess player and a chess critic. Occasionally returns to art, and it's quite a gesture and quite bold because he was capable of doing the other thing. And so the idea of the book is to go from that moment through to the taping of the banana on the wall, and to try and find a kind of through line that says these are the ways in which art is revolutionized by that gesture, the one with the urinal in the first place, and what's going on at the same time. There's quite a lot in there about the way that technology drives that, so about the way that digital art is necessarily different from other things, just that, and then you have a generation, your generation, Jacob, which grows up where that is just, it's a natural medium. It's not a new thing that's just been created. It's something you're bathed in already. So what are you going to do with it? And so it tries to sort of keep up with the way in which the world changes. Because they're about individual artists who decide things and change the way things are done. But then there's also just the context which changes the way it.
And why is this period of art so important to study?
It just happened, I guess. I mean, I think partly, so I would say because of the extreme enveloping nature of kind of digital culture and the way that everything gets copied, as we've been discussing, and whatever, that actually gestures that are rather than within a tradition are probably going to become more powerful and important, rather than things that try to eke out a tradition in order to make something just slightly new. Which is, say, a history of painting, which has given us many beautiful things that, also document changing society, and the sort of gestures that are in this book and that make up this particular version of art history in the last 100 years, probably, I think you could project into the future. You don't know what they're going to be, but that it'll be things of this nature that continue to shape how we think about what's important.
And how does the book maybe address the ongoing cry of that's not art or it's not art, that has kind of
It's
accompanied contemporary art for
Yeah,
the
it
last
celebrates
century?
it. It celebrates it, and actually, it sort of begins and ends with that cry. That's not art. And then 100 years later, despite the fact that actually we've been living with Duchamp's urinal and that gesture, and it's sort of been understood quite well. Still, 100 years later, people will still say, that's not art.
And why does that skepticism about this kind of new or alternative forms of art still persist? What does this say about kind of human nature and society?
Well, I mean, the one broader society changes very slowly, and a lot of people don't really care about, don't want to think, are not interested in thinking about art in that way. Um, you may have a great eye and you may love looking at things that reward you for looking at, but you may not be particularly interested in the kind of philosophy of how you arrive at that. And actually, so, that's more of a slow burn in terms of the way people actually think about it. Yes, I mean, it's amazing actually how unchanging a certain idea of art and beauty is as well. Even though undoubtedly, while the label has remained the same, actually what we think of as beautiful has altered quite a lot. I think, partly just because most people are not engaged with this question. That's why why it remains so easy actually to do things that are scandalous, because most people aren't interested most of the time. And all that really ever catches their eye is the stuff that's reported as being scandalous. And you may not think to yourself, somebody did that 40 years ago. Show me something really new and scandalous, because, I was already scandalized by this back in 1987. And so I think it's partly that, and the sort of idea of collecting, even though most people do it in some degree. It can be in the most modest way, just the things they like to do and put together. But the way that we put tremendous value, financial value, into things remains always a bit abstract. And particularly if you don't have tremendous wealth, it's always going to be a bit sort of, why would you do that then?
Yeah, like why would you spend millions of pounds on a shark in formaldehyde?
Precisely. Yes. Good question. Why would you do that? um, yeah, and the book is about that, and actually how much Hearst paid for the shark, which came from Australia. I think it's $6,000, maybe £6,000, or was it anyway something like that? But a sum of money. But where he bought it, I mean, he sort of commissioned its being caught, somebody to catch. Anyway. But actually, is it the person who caught the shark actually should be credited with the work? All these questions can arise.
Yeah, that's what makes art so interesting, though. It's never black or white. Usually, it's not kind of scientific in a way. It's everyone derives their own kind of opinion or truth from it, and that's what makes it so interesting in a way.
Yeah, I think, and which is why we've been talking about people who don't necessarily mean a particular thing by their work. What they know is that they mean to create the work they create, and it appeals to them in a certain way, but it doesn't mean to say it has to have this meaning. And I did also write, because the other main character in the book is Tiago Cassava, about whom I also wrote. And Cassava is really interesting in the way that Warhol is. And interestingly, in the late 60s, she went to Warhol's factory. I have an image of that in Blah. I quite like it, drawn by Eva. So it begins with her as factory girl in the factory, and there are photographs of that. And she actually tries to measure her own success against Warhol's in the late 60s, where she gets people to collect how many column inches she's getting for her work. But I mean, hers is an amazing story in terms of somebody who's always had this vision that is sort of around dots in a way, covering dots, which appears to have been a kind of childhood phenomenon, trauma, I don't know what the word is, and who, um, you know, does early work, which is as a painter and sort of working almost as a minimalist, but ends up as the great star of the Instagram age, actually, with these amazing installations where you go in, and because they're so successful, and there's always a queue at the block, no matter how big the block, you get sort of 30 seconds with the work if you want to Instagram yourself within it. It's quite interesting how somebody who is, almost, but is really, and you would say would be a long way removed from digital culture, is definitely digital native, becomes the greatest star of it. And that's a kind of beautiful thing, actually, that sometimes maybe culture catches up with people as well.
Yeah, they could almost ride the wave in a sense. Like she wasn't born with Instagram like a lot of people are nowadays, but she has kind of already had that work and had that persona, and it kind of matches her kind of brand in a way.
And it's interesting because she also always had a kind of what you might call an immersive vision of things, in that there is this sort of story about her looking at tablecloth at home when she's very small, and suddenly the dots sort of growing out and then covering everything and covering the universe. And she returns to this many times, and when she writes a letter to President Nixon to try and stop the war in Vietnam, again about blasting off into the stars and painting one another with polka dots. And kind of her vision, which is already there conceptually, is very hard to, or can only be realized in a very muted fashion at that point, because largely it's determined by how big the canvas can be. It becomes kind of storytelling instead. Whereas contemporary technology means that actually she can create quite large spaces where you are immersed in a way that actually makes you feel you're in infinity as well. And so actually this, but it is an idea she appears to have had in the 1940s. And it finds its finest expression sometime in the 2010s and on into now. But I think certainly a 21st century. But actually the original sort of notion of it is there in her early childhood. Technology allows her to capture it in a way that she couldn't before.
Yeah. You've mentioned your kind of distaste for jargon when writing. Why do people often use so much jargon, especially in the arts? I know a lot of people who say these big words and stuff. And why do you try and go against that in your writing? What are the benefits of that, and what are the reasons for people using jargon so much?
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason I don't use much jargon is I'm not very good at it. It's not my thing. Why you have jargon in the first place is, I guess, people like to, and especially with kind of university study and whatever. If you're going to be an expert or a specialist, you better have special knowledge, and it's true of almost every area of human endeavor, whatever, including industry, social services, sociology. That you create terms partly because if you are within that world, then it becomes a shorthand that's useful because you communicate quickly with other experts. It's that phenomenon that we call this or that. It also sets you apart. It shows that you're an expert if you've mastered this language, which other people struggle with. But I guess there is something a bit exclusive and exclusionary about it. And I think what's really great about the art, about culture, is the way that it can sometimes speak to lots of people across time and across all sorts of boundaries. And so, and it does it without using kind of that language. And I think that, or, it's a different kind, it's visual language or whatever, language. And so it seems a pity to kind of try and conceal that behind specialist language, which will exclude. And it's just kind of, if you can't express it in fairly simple language, then is it true?
Well, and do you really understand it if
Yeah.
you can't explain it to someone who's not in that industry or is maybe like a 5-year-old? I think a lot of people often use jargon to maybe mask their actual depth of knowledge and try and signal that they know more than they actually do. But I think the smartest people are able to condense vast amount of information into simple terms.
Yeah. And I think that is, that should be the goal with writing generally, to do that. And should make your audience bigger. It certainly, makes it possible for more people to do it. I mean, sort of understand why you'd use jargon in some degree, and also, use labels quite a lot because, I'm there saying, and that's why you get Dada, which is this and whatever. It's going, well, okay. We're going to explain that then. Okay, so up to the First World War, you have these traditions. And then people look at the madness of the world around them and people just digging trenches and then firing at one another across a no man's land for several years and people die. And you go, that's crazy. Well, then everything, it's easier just to go, the moment of Dada, a kind of post art moment. And then people in the know can go, yeah, of course, that.
Yeah.
Whereas otherwise, it might take you half an hour to sort of
True.
say.
Yeah. I guess if it's between experts, it's slightly different because they have the context of what they're talking about, but for others, it doesn't. I was just going to ask you, what do you hope readers take away from the new book Blow Up about the nature of art and disruption and innovation today? Like, what's one thing that you hope the readers take out from your new book?
Well, I mean, one is because I've been quite excited by this as a sort of medium that actually, which of course we sort of know increasingly anyway. You can do an awful lot of different kinds of writing in words and pictures, and that it's not necessarily less serious. So I hope partly that actually you can tell stories of different kinds in this medium because actually it's quite good, and it is supposed to be a real history of 20th century, early 21st century art. Obviously, how much art is in there is determined partly by how quickly you can get through that in 200 pages. Um, so partly that, I mean, one that it sort of explains why it's an exciting medium to work in, and that it manages to capture something about art history that's useful, and maybe that it uh, brings it to life in a different way. So I think, for me, what's most interesting about the book is the way that it tries to tell a story that you can find elsewhere with different decisions made about who's included. It's not, um, but in a way that brings it to life in a different way and sort of puts you there in the moment in a different way. And it's fun. I used to talk about things when I was a kid growing up in Mansfield, and I used to use the word fun quite a lot. And my mother, who was full of fun and a funny figure, used to just go, "Why do you always say fun?" And she was quite disturbed by it. But actually, I think things should still be fun.
That is a great message, and I definitely agree. Just keep it fun, keep it positive. A few kind of quick ending questions. What belief do you hold about art or photography or anything in the art industry that others might find controversial or contrarian?
I have no beliefs whatsoever.
Andy Warhol. That's what.
That was an easy question.
Yeah.
Next. Yeah.
What advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Yeah, I should be more serious about making a career actually and think more constructively about how to do that. That definitely that. Don't just dawdle along. However, it's been fun.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've made a lot of great work as a consequence of that, maybe attitude or
Done some things anyway.
yeah.
Let's say that.
In the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your work or life?
These questions, Jacob, these are in the last 5 years. I don't know. I mean, actually, so just a sort of post-COVID thing, which is I found COVID really depressing, and I really like being out and about again afterwards and engaging as much as possible with other people. I remember being here, reasonably central South London, just by the river, and the sort of all the lines drawn along the pavements when you're crossing the bridge, across Lambeth Bridge, and just being so weirded out by that and to be liberated again afterwards, and not to think I have to be 2 meters apart from everybody all the time in central London.
Yeah. Yeah. Socialization is very important, especially for my generation or the ones that were young growing up in COVID. I mean, I was 15
Yeah,
when COVID
what a time
started.
to be told you have to stay home. My goodness, how
I
was
mean, it was actually, I really enjoyed it because um for a few reasons. I don't know if I'd even do photography if it wasn't for COVID and therefore be doing this podcast because I mean technically at the end of COVID, when there were the summer restrictions, so you still had to be relatively far away from people. I went to a camera shop to get my passport photo taken and that kind of reignited a memory in my mind of constantly asking my dad when I was 4 whether I could get a camera. He said no because he thought I would never use it. And then, yeah, reignited that, then started photography, and then eventually everything leading up into the podcast. But also, I played a lot of Xbox back then, so I got to speak to my friends virtually. And also, I liked it because I was more connected to nature because I had my camera, and that's how I kind of combined my two passions, my new passion of photography and old passion with nature, which I'd neglected when I was a teenager because I wanted to be cool and fit in, and it would have been embarrassing being into like birds and badgers and stuff, or I thought so at the time. And also it was year 10, year 11, so 15 or 16, you're trying to kind of find yourself. And I think lockdown gave me the space to really kind of look within myself and think, do I really want to be hanging out with these people? Am I really acting the way I want to act? And it kind of led to this, I wouldn't say rebellion because it wasn't that extreme, but kind of, I then started following my passion and what I found interesting, and it kind of maybe just be more myself. And then I came back to school in year 11 and kind of started hanging around myself more and not trying to fit in with the cool kids as much, and eventually moving school and then kind of, I guess, cliche, but finding myself in a way. So it really benefited me. But then the winter lockdown a few months later, that was not as fun because I guess less sunshine, more
Yeah. But so, I
darkness.
mean, for you, it was a creative pause, but you did actually, it allowed you to stop and, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah. So obviously good things flow from it as well. Where were you living at the time?
At home, so Canterbury in Kent.
So reasonable access to kind of nature.
Yeah, so I'm lucky. I literally live down the road from an orchard. I live on the edge of. I mean, Canterbury is not a city compared to where you're living in London. It's literally a small town, but it has a cathedral, obviously. So I was on the edge of the city, so I was lucky in that regard. I guess if I was in central London, it would be more kind of cramped for
It
me.
was so strange. I mean, so strange.
Mm.
And the streets were empty as well, and nothing was open anymore. And you think, why am I living in a city if it's like this? This is the opposite of that. Have you seen the film, by the way, Canterbury Tale by
Oh, the Canterbury
Howell
Tale.
Pressburg? No.
I've never watched it, but it's very famous, isn't it?
Well, there's the Chaucer Canterbury Tales, but then there's a film by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburg called Canterbury Tale, which you should watch as a photographer as well. Really brilliant.
What was it about?
It's about it's set in Second World War, but it culminates in this amazing scene in Canterbury there, and it's sort of in nature. It is about. I mean, it's about somebody in a small community who's doing something terrible and trying to work out who's doing it. So it's sort of who done it in a way. But actually, I think it uses the landscape in a very beautiful way, an amazing eye. So visually, it's
Yeah, I'll add it to the watch list. Robert Shaw, ladies and gentlemen, Robert, really, really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope the audience learned as much as I did. What are you currently working on? I know you've just finished the book, but is there anything else planned?
there's another graphic novel about 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 music.
Any estimation of when that will be out? Quite a while? Or?
In about a year.
Okay, yeah. Well, we might have to do round two for when that comes out.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Bob Dylan's in there.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah. And where can people go if they want to find your work?
Amazon.
Any websites?
Easiest way.
Do you have a website?
No, not really. I used to have a Midlands one, but that's the past now. Left it behind.
Well, I'll leave the links to your work, the Amazon links to your work in the show notes for everyone to access.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, go to a bookshop if you actually want to buy anything.
Well, that's where I found your...
If you can. But Amazon is a good way of finding out what there is.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate you. And thanks for joining me.
It was real fun. Thank you very much.